The night was thick with mist, curling over the empty highway like ghostly fingers. Streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows on the rain-slick asphalt. The distant wail of a siren echoed through the city, swallowed by the weight of the darkness. Judge Alan Whitmore adjusted his glasses and sighed, gripping the steering wheel of his sleek black sedan. It had been a long day in court, filled with tense deliberations and high-profile cases. He was exhausted, eager to get home, but something in his gut twisted, a feeling he couldn't quite place. As he approached a deserted intersection, his headlights sliced through the fog, illuminating a lone figure in the middle of the road. A German shepherd stood there motionless. Alan's foot slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement as the car came to a shuddering halt mere inches from the dog. His heart pounded against his ribs. The animal didn't flinch, didn't move an inch. It just stood there, staring at him. Something was off. The dog wasn't just lost or wandering. It was blocking him. Alan flicked on his high beams, hoping to startle the animal away. Instead, the canine lifted its head higher, eyes locked onto him with an unsettling intensity. The judge swallowed hard, a cold chill creeping up his spine. Then, out of nowhere, a whistle pierced the silence. A figure in a traffic police uniform emerged from the fog, flashlight in hand. The officer waved at Alan, signaling him to stop completely. Alan rolled down his window as the officer approached, his face tense, eyes flicking between the judge and the unmoving dog. "Sir, I need you to stay inside your vehicle." Alan frowned. "What's going on? Is this dog yours?" The officer didn't answer immediately. He bent down slightly, inspecting the dog, then turned back to Alan with a look that sent a shiver down his spine. "No, sir," the officer said, voice low. "But I think this dog stopped you for a reason." Alan's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The air inside the car suddenly felt suffocating. Then the canine growled, low, deep, and threatening, but not at Alan. The dog's gaze was locked on something behind him. Alan froze. Slowly, almost too afraid to look, he turned his head towards the back seat, and that's when he saw it. Alan Whitmore's breath hitched in his throat. His fingers trembled as he reached for the dashboard. Light, illuminating the interior of his car. The back seat was empty, at least that's how it had been when he left the courthouse. But something was off. The canine dog outside the car let out another deep, guttural growl, its ears pinned back, body tense like a coiled spring. The traffic officer stiffened, his hand unconsciously drifting toward his holster. Alan's pulse pounded as he slowly turned to face the officer. "What's happening here?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle, sir. Slowly." Alan hesitated, but the weight of the moment forced him to comply. He opened the door carefully, the cold night air rushing in as he stepped onto the pavement. His knees felt weak. The canine's growl grew louder, its muscles bunched as if ready to pounce. Alan's mind raced. Why was this dog acting like this? What did it sense? The officer signaled for backup on his radio, keeping one wary eye on the German shepherd. Alan, still shaken, finally took a proper look at the dog. It was a trained police canine, no doubt about it. The way it stood, the calculated alertness in its gaze, it had been through rigorous training. But there was something else in its eyes, something urgent. The officer cautiously stepped forward. "That's no stray. It's a working canine, but where's its handler?" That question sent a fresh wave of unease washing over Alan. Just then the dog lunged, not at Alan, at his car. Its claws scraped against the back door as it barked furiously, teeth bared, saliva flying with each snarl. The sound was deafening, sending a chill down Alan's spine. Hey, stand down," the officer commanded, trying to restrain the dog, but it wouldn't stop. The dog wasn't attacking them. It was attacking whatever was inside the car. Alan's breath caught as the officer yanked open the back door, and a gloved hand shot out from the shadows. The moment the back door swung open, everything happened at once. The gloved hand lunged forward, gripping the officer's wrist in a vice-like hold. The officer barely had time to react before a masked figure sprang out from the back seat, shoving him aside and making a break for it. The K9 exploded into action. With a ferocious snarl, the dog launched itself at the fleeing man, its powerful legs propelling it forward like a bullet. The masked figure barely managed to dodge, stumbling as he took off into the darkness. Alan stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. How had someone been in his car? How long had they been? There! The officer scrambled to his feet, shouting into his radio, "Suspect on foot! Armed and dangerous! Send backup now!" The K9 didn't hesitate. It tore after the fleeing figure, its deep growls echoing into the night. The masked man was fast, but the dog was faster. Within seconds, it closed the distance, its powerful jaws latching onto the man's arm. A scream of pain ripped through the air. The man collapsed onto the pavement, thrashing as the K9 held him in an iron grip. The officer rushed forward, gun drawn. "Don't move! Hands where I can see them!" Alan stood frozen, his body trembling with shock. His mind was reeling. Someone had been inside his car, waiting for what? The officer cuffed the man, pressing a knee into his back to keep him down. The K9 released its hold, panting, its eyes still locked onto the suspect, as if daring him to try something. "Who are you?" The officer barked, flipping the man over. Alan stepped closer, his stomach twisting as the streetlights illuminated the suspect's face. He didn't recognize him. A rough beard, piercing dark eyes, and an expression full of hate. But there was something else. Something unsettling. The man was smiling. Alan's blood ran cold. "You're making a mistake," the suspect muttered, voice laced with eerie confidence. "You have no idea what's coming." The officer ignored him, frisking him for weapons. A switchblade clattered onto the pavement. A folded piece of paper fell out of his pocket. Alan's eyes landed on it. A sick feeling churned in his gut. His name was written on it, Judge Alan Whitmore. Before Alan could react, the K9 let out a sharp, warning bark. Its ears pricked up, its eyes scanning the darkness. And then, somewhere in the distance, another whistle pierced the night. The dog's body went rigid. Alan's breath caught. There was someone else out there, watching, waiting, and this wasn't over. The night air felt thicker now, suffocating. Alan's pulse thundered in his ears as the eerie whistle faded into the darkness. The K9 stood stock still, its entire body tense, ears twitching as if listening for something only it could hear. Its breath came in quick, sharp bursts, its sharp eyes locked onto the shadows beyond the streetlights. The officer finished securing the suspect and yanked him up. "Who else is out there?" he demanded. The man chuckled, low and taunting. "You think I'm the only one?" Alan's stomach twisted. The way he said it, it wasn't a bluff. The K9 growled again, stepping forward, muscles coiled like a loaded spring. Then the streetlights flickered. A chill ran down Alan's spine. The officer stiffened. The air felt charged, like something was about to happen. The suspect grinned through bloody teeth. "Tick-tock, Judge! You're running out of time!" A loud pop echoed through the night. The officer barely had time to react before the power cut out completely. The street went black. The only light now came from the patrol car's red and blue emergency lights, flashing ominously across the wet pavement. Alan's breath hitched. "What just happened?" "Stay close," the officer ordered, voice taut with tension. He gripped his radio, but only static crackled back. The K9 snapped its head to the left, barking furiously at something in the distance. Alan followed its gaze, but all he saw was darkness, and then footsteps, multiple footsteps, slow, purposeful, surrounding them. Alan's throat went dry. "They're not alone!" The officer yanked his gun free, shifting his stance, scanning the area. The K9 was now fully locked onto something invisible in the shadows, its bark more aggressive, more desperate. Then another whistle. closer this time. And suddenly, the suspect started laughing. Low, cold, mocking. Alan's skin crawled. The officer tightened his grip on his gun. "We need to move, now." But before they could, the canine dog took off into the darkness. "Wait, no, come back," Alan shouted, but the German shepherd was already gone, vanishing into the thick fog. And then, just as suddenly, the barking stopped. Silence. Too much silence. Alan's chest tightened. The K9 had been their only warning system, their only line of defense. And now, it was gone. The officer gritted his teeth. "We have to find that dog, now!" Alan swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the fact that the K9 had run off into the darkness, or the reason why it felt the need to. Alan's breath came in shallow gasps as the K9's barking faded into the distance. The weight of the moment settled heavy in his chest. The officer gripped his radio, frustration tightening his jaw. "Dispatch, we have an urgent situation. K9 unit has broken from command. Possible multiple hostiles in the vicinity. Requesting immediate backup." Static. Nothing but static. Alan wiped his palms on his coat, his mind racing. The street was too quiet now. The suspect, though restrained, still wore that unsettling grin. The officer shoved him against the patrol car. "Who's out there? Tell me now." The man only chuckled. "You think you're in control, officer?" His eyes flicked toward Alan. "You think you're safe, Judge?" Alan's pulse thundered. He knew him, but from where? Then a single gunshot rang out in the distance. Alan flinched. The officer whipped around, gun raised, scanning the darkness. Then the barking started again, louder, fiercer, and mixed with a deep, guttural snarl. It wasn't just the K9 anymore. Something else was out there. The officer's grip tightened on his firearm. "We need to move. We can't stay exposed like this." Alan nodded, but his feet felt like lead. The K9 was in trouble. He couldn't just leave it out there, not after it had saved his life. A shadow flickered in the corner of his vision. Movement. A figure shifting just beyond the patrol car's flashing lights. The officer spun, aiming his weapon. "Show yourself!" Silence. Then, a metallic clinking sound. Alan's stomach dropped. That was a weapon being cocked. Before he could react, glass shattered. The patrol car's rear window exploded as a figure lunged from the darkness. The officer barely had time to fire before he was tackled to the ground. Alan stumbled back, heart hammering, as two more shadowy figures emerged from the dark. The suspect in cuffs? Still smirking. Alan's mind screamed at him to run, but before he could move, the K9 dog came charging back straight toward him. But something was wrong. The dog wasn't just running, it was dragging something behind it. And the moment Alan saw what it was, his breath caught in his throat, because the K9 had a bloodied police badge clenched between its teeth, and it wasn't from their officer. Alan's mind reeled as he stared at the bloodied police badge hanging from the K9's mouth. Implications hit him like a freight train. Another officer had been taken down. But who? Where? The German shepherd panted heavily, its chest rising and falling rapidly. Blood, not its own, stained the fur around its mouth. The dog had fought something. Someone. The shadows around them felt thicker now, closing in. The streetlights were still out, leaving only the strobing red and blue flashes of the patrol car's emergency lights. Each flicker cast twisting shadows across the pavement, making the darkness feel alive. The restrained suspect was still grinning, as if this was nothing more than a game. The officer groaned as he shoved his attacker off and scrambled to his feet, his gun locked on the figures in the dark. But Alan barely heard him. His focus was on the K9. The dog had just saved his life, and now it was begging him to trust it. Alan hesitated only a second before kneeling. "Come here, boy," he whispered. The K9's ears twitched at his voice, its sharp eyes locking onto his. It hesitated as if unsure. Alan slowly reached out a hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled, not commanding, just open. The German Shepherd took a step forward, then another, before pressing its warm, solid weight against his chest. Alan exhaled, shakily, as he ran a hand over the dog's tense body. "You're okay," he murmured. "You're okay now." The dog trembled slightly but didn't pull away. It trusted him. A sharp whisper broke the moment. "They're moving," the officer hissed. Alan looked up. The attackers were spreading out, melting into the darkness. This wasn't a random assault. They were trying to surround them. The K9 growled low, pressing closer to Alan, tail stiff. It wasn't just seeking comfort anymore. It was protecting him. The officer grabbed Alan's arm. "We have to get out of here now." Alan shook his head, not without knowing what happened to that cop. The officer hesitated. His job was to protect the judge, but he knew Alan was right. If the K9 had found that badge in blood, it meant an officer had gone down nearby, and if they were still alive, they needed help. Alan looked down at the German Shepherd, his grip tightening in the dog's fur. "Can you take us to them?" The K9 whined, eyes flicking toward the darkness. It hesitated, for only a moment before turning and bolting toward the alleyway. Alan took off after it, heart pounding. "Judge, wait!" the officer shouted. But Alan was already gone, chasing the only chance they had of finding the truth. The alley was pitch black. Alan's breath came hard and fast as he followed the K9, barely able to see more than a few feet ahead. The air smelled like wet concrete, rusted metal, and something else, something thick, metallic, blood. His pulse pounded in his ears as his shoes splashed through a puddle. The German Shepherd was ahead, its body low, ears twitching as it sniffed the air. Then suddenly, a weak, rattling breath. Alan froze. The K9 let out a soft whimper and darted toward the sound. Alan followed, heart in his throat, and then he saw him. A uniformed officer lay sprawled against a dumpster, his badge ripped from his chest. His face was pale, slick with sweat, and blood pooled beneath him, soaking into his vest. Alan dropped to his knees beside him. "Officer, can you hear me?" The man's eyelids fluttered, his lips moved, but his voice was so weak it was barely more than a whisper. Alan leaned in. "What happened? Who did this to you?" The officer's fingers twitched. His eyes flicked past Alan, and then a shadow moved. Alan barely had time to react before something lunged from the darkness. The K9 snarled viciously and threw itself into the attack. Alan didn't have time to think, only time to brace for whatever. Nightmare had just found them. A dark figure lunged from the shadows, its movement quick and precise, like a predator striking its prey. Before Alan could react, the K9 launched itself forward, teeth bared, a deep snarl ripping through the silence. The force of the impact sent the attacker stumbling backward, their cry of pain swallowed by the dog's relentless assault. Alan scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering. The alley was dimly lit, but he could see the gleam of a knife in the attacker's hand. The blade flashed as the figure swung wildly at the K9, trying to shake the dog off, but the German Shepherd was relentless. It clamped down on the attacker's arm, jerking its head violently, forcing the knife from their grip. The weapon clattered against the pavement, spinning toward Alan's feet. Alan didn't hesitate. He snatched the knife, gripping it tightly, though his hands trembled. His breath came in sharp gasps as he turned to the wounded officer. "Stay with me," he urged, pressing his hand against the officer's bleeding wound. The man winced but gave a weak nod, his face pale and slick with sweat. The fight between the K9 and the attacker raged on. The attacker threw a desperate punch, catching the dog on its side. The K9 yelped but didn't let go. Its teeth stayed locked on the man's arm, refusing to surrender. Alan's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just a random attack. There was something bigger at play. He spun around, searching the alley. Were there more of them? Then a sound. The unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. Alan barely had time to react before another dark silhouette stepped into the alleyway. The figure raised a gun, its barrel aimed directly at Alan's chest. Alan's blood ran cold. He was unarmed, vulnerable, exposed. The canine growled, releasing its hold on the first attacker and spinning toward the new threat. Its stance was rigid, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. The gunman chuckled softly. "You should have stayed." "In your car, Judge," the voice said, calm, almost amused. Alan's stomach dropped. He knew that voice. The realization hit him like a brick. He squinted through the darkness, trying to see the man's face clearly, and then it clicked. Assistant District Attorney Jason Cole. Alan felt his knees go weak. "Jason." Cole stepped closer, the gun still leveled at Alan. "Surprised?" He asked, voice smooth, almost casual. "You shouldn't be." Alan's mind raced. This man had worked alongside him for years. They had built cases together, sent criminals to prison, and now he was pointing a gun at him. The wounded officer groaned behind Alan, his breathing labored. The canine inched forward, teeth bared, waiting for a command. Alan swallowed hard. "Why?" he managed to say. "Why are you doing this?" Jason smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Because you don't know when to walk away." Alan's pulse pounded in his ears. Walk away from what? Then it all started making sense. The murder case Alan had presided over last year. The high-profile trial where a corrupt network of city officials had been exposed. Cole had been on the prosecution team. Had he been part of it? Before Alan could say another word, Cole sighed. "I never wanted to do this. But you just wouldn't. Let things go." His finger tightened on the trigger. Alan's breath caught. He was about to die. And then the canine moved. It was instantaneous, explosive. The German shepherd lunged with the force of a bullet, jaws locking around Cole's gun arm. The gun fired, but the shot went wild, hitting the side of the dumpster. Sparks erupted as metal scraped metal. Alan didn't hesitate. He surged forward, slamming into Cole, knocking them both to the ground. The impact rattled through him as Cole let out a grunt of pain. The canine held on, snarling, its body twisting. As it fought to rip the gun away, Cole struggled beneath Alan, his free hand grabbing at Alan's throat, squeezing. Alan gasped, his vision darkening as he clawed at the man's wrist, trying to break free. His fingers found something. The knife. With the last of his strength, Alan thrust the handle of the blade against Cole's temple. Cole's grip loosened instantly. He let out a strangled sound before his body went limp. Alan rolled off him, coughing, dragging in desperate breaths. His hands shook as he scrambled for the gun, shoving it away from Cole's reach. The canine stepped back, panting heavily, its fur bristling as it watched Alan closely. Alan turned toward the wounded officer, his heart still pounding. The man's breathing was shallow, but he was still alive. In the distance, sirens screamed through the night. Backup was finally coming. Alan reached out and placed a shaky hand on the canine's head. The dog whined softly, pressing against him. Alan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had made it, but something told him this wasn't over yet. Alan's hands were still shaking as he pressed them against the cold pavement. His throat burned where Cole had nearly crushed his windpipe, and his vision swam from the adrenaline crash. But he couldn't rest, not yet. The canine stood by his side, its fur bristling, ears perked, watching Jason Cole's unconscious form like a sentry ready for battle. The wounded officer behind them let out a soft groan, his breath shallow but steady. Then a sudden movement. Alan's instinct screamed at him. He spun just in time to see Cole stirring. A flash of silver caught the dim streetlights. A second. Knife hidden in his boot. He's not done. Cole's hand whipped forward, the blade aiming straight for Alan's chest. Alan had no time to move, no time to think, and then the K9 leapt. The German shepherd threw itself between Alan and the blade, twisting mid-air to take the impact. The knife sank deep into the dog's side. Alan's breath left him in a choked gasp. "No!" The canine let out a sharp yelp but didn't retreat. Even with a knife lodged in its side, the dog bit down on Cole's wrist with crushing force, forcing him to drop the blade. Blood spurted as Cole screamed, his face contorted in pain. Alan reacted without thinking. He lunged forward, grabbing Cole by the collar, and slammed his fist into the man's jaw. Cole's head snapped back and his body went limp. This time, he was truly out cold. Alan didn't care. He spun toward the canine. The dog collapsed onto its side, whimpering. The knife was still embedded in its body, dark blood seeping into the pavement. "No, no, no," Alan muttered, dropping to his knees. He pressed his hands to the dog's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. The canine's breath came in quick, shallow pants, its once bright eyes flickering. Alan's own chest ached. "Stay with me," he pleaded, his voice raw. The sirens were louder now, closer. Red and blue lights flickered against the alley walls. Help was coming, but would it be fast enough? Alan stroked the canine's head, his fingers trembling. This dog had saved his life. A painful lump formed in his throat. He could see it now, the same fierce loyalty, the same unstoppable courage that had made this dog a canine officer. And now, it was dying for him. "Don't you dare give up," Alan whispered. His voice cracked. "You hear me? You fought this hard. You don't stop now." The dog's ear twitched weakly, as if trying to acknowledge his words. Alan clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening over the wound. "Help is coming," he promised. "Just hold on." The sound of car doors slamming, rushing footsteps, shouted voices, paramedics flooded the alley. Alan refused to move, refused to let go. One medic knelt beside him. "Sir, we need to get him to an emergency vet, now." Alan nodded, his eyes never leaving the canines. "Do whatever you have to." The medics moved fast, securing the dog onto a stretcher. Alan stood, swaying slightly, but refused to let them take the dog alone. He walked beside them, one hand gripping the stretcher as they rushed toward an ambulance. The last thing he saw before stepping inside was Cole being handcuffed and dragged away. Alan didn't care. All that mattered was the canine, and whether or not it would make it through the night. The ambulance tore through the city streets, its sirens wailing as Alan sat stiffly beside the stretcher, one hand gripping the canines. Poor. The German shepherd's breathing was ragged, its chest rising and falling in uneven spurts. Blood soaked the white bandages the paramedics had wrapped around its wound, and its fur was damp with sweat. Alan couldn't tear his eyes away. Was this dog really going to die tonight? He clenched his jaw. Not if he had anything to do with it. "Hang in there, buddy," Alan murmured, his voice hoarse. "You saved me. Now it's my turn." The canine let out a soft whimper but didn't move. The paramedics worked quickly, administering pain medication, stabilizing the wound as best as they could. But the lead medic, a woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, glanced at Alan and shook her head. "We're losing time," she said. "We need to get him into surgery the second we arrive." Alan nodded, his throat thick. "Just keep him alive." The dog's breathing slowed, its eyelids fluttered. Alan felt panic rise in his chest. "No," he whispered. "Don't you dare." He squeezed the dog's paw gently. "I don't even know your name," he admitted, his voice shaking. The paramedic glanced at a faded tag still attached to the canine's collar. "Says his name was Max." Alan swallowed hard. Max. He looked down at the brave dog who had thrown itself between him and a blade. A retired officer, a warrior, a protector. "You hear that, Max?" Alan said softly. "You're not done yet. You've got more fight in you." The ambulance skidded to a halt in front of the emergency veterinary hospital. The doors were thrown open and medics rushed Max inside. Alan followed, his heart pounding. But before he could step past the entrance, a firm hand grabbed his arm. Alan turned sharply, his nerves still raw from the attack. But he froze when he saw a uniformed officer standing before him, Sergeant Dwayne Harper. Alan recognized him instantly, one of the highest-ranking officers in the precinct and the man in charge of the city's K9 division. Harper's gaze flicked to the blood on Alan's shirt, then to the stretcher disappearing into the hospital doors. "I heard what happened," he said. "That dog just saved your life." Alan let out a rough laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, more than once." Harper studied him, then nodded. "Come with me." Alan hesitated but followed. Harper led him to a quieter section of the hospital, a small waiting area filled with worn chairs and a faint smell of antiseptic. Alan sank into one of the chairs, his body still aching, his mind still reeling. Harper sat across from him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You know who that dog is, don't you?" Harper asked. Alan shook his head. "I know he used to be a K9, but that's it." Harper exhaled, glancing toward the hallway where Max had been taken. Max wasn't just any K9. He was one of the best, trained for high-risk operations, bomb detection, and suspect apprehension. He served this city for years, but 2 years ago his handler, Officer Ryan Kessler, was killed in the line of duty. Alan felt a chill run through him. Harper continued, his voice heavy. "After Kessler died, Max refused to work with anyone else. He stopped following commands, stopped eating, wouldn't even leave the station without Kessler's badge attached to his collar." Alan swallowed. "We tried to rehome him, but he ran away from every house he was placed in," Harper said. "Eventually he disappeared completely." Alan's breath caught. "And now he's here," Harper nodded. "It's like he was searching for a purpose, and somehow he found you." Alan looked down at his hands, processing the weight of Harper's words. A dog with no home, no purpose, no handler, and yet when the moment had come, Max had chosen to protect him. Alan rubbed a hand over his face. What did this mean? Before he could think too much, a door swung open down the hall. The lead veterinarian walked out, her expression unreadable. Alan shot to his feet. "How is he?" Alan asked, his pulse hammering. The vet sighed, wiping her hands on her scrubs. "The knife wound was deep, but we were able to remove the blade without damaging any vital organs. He lost a lot of blood, but—" She paused, then gave Alan a small smile. "He's going to make it." Alan let out a breath he didn't realize. He was holding. Relief flooded his chest, so overwhelming it nearly knocked him over. "Can I see him?" Alan asked. The vet hesitated. "He's still weak, but I think he'd like that." Alan followed her into the recovery room. Max lay on a padded bed, bandaged and hooked up to an IV, his eyes half-lidded. But when Alan approached, the dog slowly lifted his head, a weak thump of his tail against the bed. Alan knelt beside him, reaching out to stroke his fur. "You did good, buddy," he murmured. Max let out a slow, contented sigh. Leaning into Alan's touch, Harper stood in the doorway watching the interaction. Alan turned to him. "What happens to him now?" Alan asked. Harper crossed his arms. "He's officially retired from duty. No precinct will take him back. He needs a home." Alan looked back at Max, the weight of the moment settling over him. This dog had saved his life, had fought for him, had chosen him, and now Max was waiting. Alan didn't hesitate. "I'll take him." 2 weeks later, the morning sun cast golden light over Alan's small backyard. A crisp autumn breeze rustled the trees, sending leaves tumbling across the grass. Birds chirped softly in the distance, but Alan's focus was on the German shepherd lying beside him, Max. His wounds had healed, though a faint scar remained beneath his fur, a permanent reminder of the night he had saved Alan's life. The dog lay stretched out on the porch, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed. He was peaceful. Something Alan hadn't seen before. For the past 2 weeks, Max had been adjusting to his new home. It hadn't been easy. At first he had been restless, constantly pacing near the front door, as if expecting to be called back to duty. But slowly, Alan had noticed the changes. Max no longer flinched at every loud noise, no longer stood guard by the window all night. He was learning to be a dog again, and Alan had changed too. For years his life had been defined by his job, the courtroom, the rulings, the endless weight of justice resting on his shoulders. But since that night, the night a K9 had blocked his car and turned his world upside down, Alan had felt something different, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. A soft whimper brought him back to the present. Alan glanced down and saw Max staring up at him, his deep brown eyes filled with something almost human: loyalty, trust, home. Alan chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. "What are you looking at, huh?" Max huffed, then suddenly lunged forward. Not in attack, but playfully. Alan barely had time to react before the 75-pound dog tackled him, knocking him flat on his back in the grass. A startled laugh burst from Alan's throat as Max wagged his tail wildly, licking his face. All right, I get it. You're happy." Alan laughed, trying and failing to push the dog off. Max barked, a real genuine bark of joy, and finally flopped down beside Alan in the grass. For a long time, neither of them moved, just a man and a dog, a judge and a warrior, two souls who had saved each other. Alan stared up at the sky, his chest warm with something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was fate. Maybe Max had stopped his car that night for a reason. Maybe they had both been lost, waiting for something, someone, to show them the way. Alan turned his head, watching as Max closed his eyes, his body finally relaxed, at peace. And for the first time in a long time, Alan felt at peace too. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share and comment below. Have you ever witnessed an unbreakable bond between a human and a dog? Let us know.